All right, so in the last lesson, we got our table view displaying our food categories, and it looks pretty dang good. The only thing that we need to fix right here is our sandwiches. Oh, and there are a few other things. I'm not sure you can tell, but there is a light dividing line between each of our cells right now. Also, if you click on one of these cells, you see this gray highlighting, okay? And I don't like either of those two things, so we're gonna fix that. So let's jump into our storyboard, and we are going to select our table view, and here under separator, it says default, we are going to do none. And then select our category cell, and we are going to set selection, so that was that gray selection being shown, we are going to do none. Okay, so that is good. Now what we want to do is select our label here, and we saw that sandwiches was too big at this current font size. So what we can do with labels is something called auto shrink, okay? And so if we set here, we have two options. We have a minimum font scale and a minimum font size. So if you do minimum font size, you can set an actual font size that should be the minimum. So what you can do is say, shrink it down to this size before you start truncating it, okay? What we're gonna do is we're gonna do a minimum font scale, in which case we say, shrink it down to 50% before you start to truncate it, okay? So that looks good. Let's go ahead and run that again and make sure it works. All right, so that looks good. We no longer have the divider line, and if you click on it, then you don't get any of that ugly gray. And now our sandwiches fits perfectly. So it shrunk it down just far enough to make it all fit. All right, so that looks good. So now what we want to do is be able to click on one of these and actually move to a new view controller, right? So let's go ahead and get that going. First thing we're gonna need is somewhere for it to go to. So let's add another view controller here in our storyboard. Just gonna open up our object library and search for view controller, and just going to drop that in. And now we need to add a segue from this view controller to our new one, okay? And we can do that by holding Control and clicking on View Controller right here, and then dragging to our new view controller, letting go, and you'll see here manual segue, and we have a few options: show, show detail, present modally, pop over, custom. The most common one that you will be using is just show. That's just your standard segue from one view controller to another. And you'll see this pop up here. And this is our segue, and we can give it an identifier, and if we had specific classes, we could give it, let's go ahead and give this an identifier. We're gonna call it to recipes selection, okay? And we'll be using this identifier later on. All right, so we have our view controller here in storyboard, but we're gonna need a view controller.swift file, right? So I'm gonna click on our controller here. I'm gonna right click and say new file. And with the Cocoa Touch class, I'm gonna say next. And then here we're going to be using a UI view controller. And this is going to be the view where we select a recipe from our recipes data set. So I'm gonna call this recipes selection VC. And then we're gonna say next and create. All right, so now we have our second view controller here. And that reminds me, I don't like it with the default name of view controller. So let's go ahead and rename this. I'm gonna right click here and say refactor, rename, and let's just give this a more descriptive name. How about home VC? And we'll say return. And then we're gonna go to main.storyboard, and we are going to set the class of our generic view controller to be that of a recipes selection VC. Okay, so now this view, this UI view, is hooked up with this recipes selection vc.swift file. So now this file can control the UI that we put into this view controller. And one thing that I want to point out is because we have our navigation controller here, once we added a second view controller, we automatically got this back button for free. All right, so let's go into our home VC. And we need to know, we need the table view to tell us when we have selected one of these cells, okay? So that is going to be one of our UI table view delegate optional methods. And we can say did select row at, okay? So this tells the delegate that the specified row is now selected. So the delegate being the view controller, we are telling the view controller that a specified row is now selected. Thanks, table view. And so now what we can do is whenever we select one of these rows, we can segue from this view controller to the recipes selection view controller with this function, PrepareForSegue. Okay, so perform segue with an identifier and a sender, and this initiates the segue with the specified identifier from the current view controller storyboard file. And so this is where we add our identifier for that specific segue, and we said it was to recipes selection. And the sender is this view controller, so self. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run that and see if that's working. All right, so now when I select one of these, we should segue to the second view controller, which we are doing. Perfect. If we go back, we can select any of these and segue to it. All right, perfect. But now we need to be able to make it so that when we click on one of these, this view controller knows which one we clicked on, right? So how do we do that? Now, before I show you how to do it in code, I have another parable for you, all right? So imagine you are in a room. In that room, let's say you have a pizza. There is a door in that room that leads to another room. You want to go to the other room, but you want to take your pizza with you. However, that particular pizza can't leave the room. But there is an empty pizza box in the second room, and if you go up to the door and hold up your full pizza box to the door, the pizza box on the other side will magically fill up with the same pizza you have on your side. You can then walk through the door, leaving the first pizza behind, but having an identical one waiting for you on the other side of the door. So in this example, the room you are currently in is the first view controller. The pizza that we have is knowing which cell was selected. The second room is our second view controller, recipe selection VC, and the empty pizza box is a variable without a value. So what we need in our second view controller is an empty box, and that is simply a variable. And we are going to call it selected category. And this is going to be of type string. And I am implicitly unwrapping it with an exclamation point because this has to exist for this view controller to even work. We are definitely going to be passing a string, which is the selected category, to this view controller. Now let's go back to our home VC. And we talked about, in my little parable, an action that you take when you go up to the door with your full pizza box, which magically makes the pizza box on the other side, which was empty, fill up with the exact same pizza that you have in room 1. So we do this programmatically in a function called PrepareForSegue, okay? We looked at this one briefly in the protocol and delegate lessons. Okay, so this is a function that is called directly before segueing to the next view controller. And with this method, we get the segue, so we can do a check to make sure that we are segueing to the correct destination. So let's do that. We need a reference to the second VC. So I'm going to say if let recipes VC is equal to segue.destination, and that will return a generic view controller, which you can see right here, UI view controller, and we need to cast that as a recipe selection VC. Okay, so now we have a reference to the second room from our first room, and with that we can get a reference to the empty pizza box, which is our selected category variable in our second view controller, or in other words, the second room. Okay, so now back in our first room, we have reference to that empty pizza box. So now we need to hold up our full pizza box to the door and have that be magically sent over and copied into the empty pizza box. And we do that by setting a variable here in didSelectRow at, okay? So I'm gonna comment this to get rid of that error. And what we're gonna do is we are going to create a variable here that will hold the selected food category when we select one of the cells. And we're gonna call this category to pass. And this is going to be of type string. So then here in didSelectRow at, we are going to set our category to pass variable equal to the data.categories, and then we're going to access the correct food category in that array by saying indexPath.row, and then we're going to access the title of that particular food category, and we're setting that equal to our category to pass. Then I'm going to uncomment this, and we are going to set the variable in the second room equal to the value of this variable right here, category to pass. All right, so let's run through that one more time. When we select one of our cells and I click, we first set our variable category to pass equal to a string, okay? And that string is one of these right here, burgers, pasta, pizza, etc. Then we begin to perform the segue. And before we actually transition, we first go through this PrepareForSegue method right here, wherein we get reference to our empty variable in recipe selection VC and set that variable's value equal to category to pass, which we set right here. And then we transition to the second view controller, and now this variable has the value that we passed over. And we can test that by saying print selected category. And let's run this and test. All right, so when I click on one of these, we should see printed out down here the category that we selected, and we do burgers. All right, let's try pasta. Perfect. Let's try pizza. All right, so that is definitely working. All right, so that is how you can pass data from one view controller to another. The process is setting a variable's value to whatever you want to pass, having an empty variable on the other side, and then in PrepareForSegue, setting the variable's value on the other side equal to the value that you want to pass, and then performing the segue. All right, so now we are prepared to get to work on our recipe selection VC, because now we know what category has been selected, and we can use that to present the correct recipes. All right, so we will be working on that in the next one, and I'll see you there.